So by now, most people have heard of the suicide of Anthony Bourdain. I'll speak briefly on that matter, but I'm not going to speak too much on that specifically, because I want to have a broader talk about suicide, finality, and related issues. But every time there's a celebrity suicide, the press comes out, and what they engage in is essentially virtue signaling. They talk about suicide prevention hotlines. They talk about what can be done. And a few weeks pass, and of course, as can be expected, people move on and they get on with their lives. Such is the nature of the beast when it comes to suicide. On the matter and topic of Anthony Bourdain, I'll say at the outset that Scott Adams, the prophet of Donald Trump, the one who foretold his coming, as it were, made an interesting and insightful comment on his eyes. And then I scrolled through a number of pictures of Anthony Bourdain, and it became clear that Scott Adams was correct, that Anthony Bourdain had, and I'm paraphrasing, what you could call lying eyes or dead eyes, which is to say he could smile, and he would smile, but the eyes, in fact, in normal cases of a smile, they have to concomitantly integrate themselves into the smile. And in a sense, the eyes, too, must smile. But if you look carefully at the photographs of Anthony Bourdain, you generally don't see that. He has these dead eyes, and we know quite a bit about his life history, drug addiction, struggles with depression. At the very least, he had some major neurochemical disturbances going on in his body and his brain. And his outward projection, the dead eyes, the half-fake smile, probably almost certainly a consequence of that. Despite his celebrity status and despite his wealth and all these things, he had clear issues. Most people have not delved into the true direct catalyst to his suicide, namely recent publications of his so-called girlfriend, clearly in intimate gesticulation and intimate poses with another man, published for the public good to see, which he almost certainly caught wind of. One can assume, based on his life trajectory, 2 divorces, and his final suicide, that this act, or this publication of these instances of effectively cheating, or at least implied cheating, were enough to precipitate his unfortuitous hanging. And I think a lot of people miss that message. Now, a greater message to be taken away from this is the fact that many, many suicides, in the case of older men, I'll get into the case of younger men in a bit, are caused by the destruction of a relationship, or especially destruction of a marriage. We all know, generally speaking, the stats of what happens when a divorce takes place. The man is severed from his offspring, and, of course, he's deprived of a great deal of his funds for the sake of alimony. These men, even if they don't kill themselves, look like, well, broken tools at best. Brendan Fraser comes to mind. I recently discovered that he owes $900,000 in child support a year, had petitioned the judge for a decrease and, of course, did not receive it. Well, we know how it goes. So to say that Anthony Bourdain's infelicitous suicide came out of the blue, well, maybe to some, but not really. And the greatest criticism I would level is, of course, not at Anthony Bourdain, but at the media coverage, which I suppose you can't really expect them to do much with. They run through the normal 7-Eleven program, as it were, of reporting on suicide and the great rise in the past few decades, etc., and eventually they get over it and they move on. We all get on with our business eventually, but what strikes me every time a report of a suicide is made is that, celebrity suicide, the underlying causes are never addressed. Now, I'm going to spend the rest of this video talking about some of these underlying causes, and I'm also going to talk about the nature of suicide itself, a bit about how it was historically perceived, and just finality in general. Suicide is a highly individual act. It occurs when, for whatever reason, an individual has reached the breaking point of his ability to cope with a certain set of circumstances. These circumstances can be psychological, which, of course, psychological circumstances are also physiological, neurochemical problems in the brain, etc., or they can be based purely on the environment. The catastrophic loss of family, friends, job, the bereavement and deprivation of basically everything, these can be a direct impetus. Some suicides are precipitated by physical pain. There isn't any one shoe size fits all in establishing an etiology for suicide. But there definitely are trends. Most of the suicides, and we'll look through some of these stats, we can look up here at the screen, are obviously men, and these are particular to the United States, but this holds true throughout the world. And there tend to be trends you can observe. Most of the suicides are men, and most of them are either, in the case of the United States, Native American, American Indian, I don't know the politically correct term these days, whatever, Native American or white men. And there's a stark difference between those two majorities in terms of suicide committal and the black and Hispanic population. And I'm going to go into some of the possible reasons for why this is the case. Generally speaking, you can see a trend and a pattern here, because these cases of suicide correlate, which you can see also here in the map, with large numbers of states that happen to be in the majority populated still by whites or white Europeans. If you look at the states, such as California or New York, you quickly get the sense that they have the fewest suicides, well, at least fewer, significantly fewer, than the more wide-open states. I think there are a couple of things going on here. Now, one thing we can definitely assume that requires no speculation is that urban centers, heavily populated states, have more people in them. One thing about the states you can see is that they tend to be sparsely populated. There tend to be very large gaps between townships, cities, although I think I would be hesitant to call any of the places that are cities in the sort of New York or LA sense, but huge stretches of land separating them. And you get this sense of isolation just by looking at the landscape of a place such as Idaho. So whites and Native American men fill out the top, and that makes sense. What you can observe with both of these populations is they tend not to have strong communities of any sort. They tend to live in isolation. The many different tribes of Native American descent have no relationship to each other beyond the relationship they have to individual tribes, such as Cherokee, Mohawk, etc. Many of these tribes hardly exist in any real context anymore. And it's a well-known fact that many Native Americans give in to drink. They did not evolve with the enzymes that help you metabolize alcohol efficiently, and therefore they're very susceptible to this. I'm not saying this is the primary cause, but it is something that happens there. And the communities are largely shattered and broken. So it doesn't really surprise you, in light of that you have this fact that Native American men are most likely to kill themselves. In the case of white men, it's not too dissimilar. You don't have strong communities. And I think actually black communities, I'll get into that in a bit, are relatively strong, and certainly Hispanic communities are strong, that reflect the type of group solidarity you find in some of these other ethnic groups. Now, it's certainly the case in the Native Americans that at some former time they clearly had group solidarity, but because Native American tribes don't exist anymore as such, they've been so dispersed over time through the history. We know most of the history, obviously. Huge number of deaths due to immune incompatibilities that existed between colonists and Native Americans, which is to say most Native Americans throughout both North and South America were wiped out by disease. And so the numbers just dwindled. And of course, because of the nature and growth of the United States in general, the community doesn't exist. That's the point. If the community doesn't exist, what do? You turn to other means, you turn to drink. I would suspect that it's not too dissimilar with white men, young white men, although, of course, they likely would have, on average, the enzyme to help them metabolize alcohol, but clearly these are wide open spaces, places like Idaho, Wyoming, etc., states where you don't see a lot of people. There isn't really a strong sense of community and not many opportunities on top of that. And I think this is basically where you see this trend. And by the way, the number one killer of young men in terms of suicide is death by firearm, and it tends to be young white men who kill themselves via firearm. If we look at these other populations, the black male population, you see some decently prominent differences in terms of frequency of suicide committal. There are larger populations. Black populations tend to live in larger urban groups. These conurbations naturally tend to stack up people just in sheer numbers. And for all of the flaws and failings of black ghetto culture, which produces the horrific results such as, the largest killer of young black men is other black men shooting each other mutually. That is gun violence vis-a-vis black-on-black man. That there nonetheless is a sense of community. It's almost tribal. That is to say, gangs and the notion of the hood produces a communal sense in an urban setting that does not exist in some of these wide open spaces such as Idaho, Wyoming, etc. You see some stark differences there. And the feeling of belonging that presumably someone who is a ghetto blaster who happens to be black might have, despite the almost intrinsic violence that tends to take place in these communities, is still strong enough to prevent the types of suicides that are much more prominent among whites and Native Americans. I think cohesion, group cohesion, and community tend to be the major factors here. And then we come to the Hispanic population. Very, very similar, although it tends to be less gang violence. I would suspect that the familial relations, extended family, etc., tend to be quite strong. Now, I grew up not being Hispanic myself, but amongst many Hispanic people, and I could observe them quite a bit. In fact, the little Spanish I do speak was picked up from the streets, as it were. And they tend to have very strong familial connections. They tend to be, not always, but oftentimes Catholic. And a lot of these are strong indicators against suicide, or indicators that it would be less likely and less prominent. Again, tend to live in large urban centers. And then finally we come to the Asian population, and I think it's a bit surprising because in East Asian, Northeast Asian populations, proper China, South Korea, Japan, they have some of the highest suicide rates in the world, but it's due to different reasons. I think in the context of the United States, one, they don't make up a huge number of their population, but also they tend to stick together. And group solidarity in a country that tends to have a very mixed bag in terms of different populations can be a huge mitigating factor in this. So I think, to go over it one more time, a final time, in the case of Native Americans, their communities don't really exist anymore. They've been dispersed. And it's not even clear if a person who identifies as Native American actually belongs to the tribe as such. He might have Native American blood, or can be identified in terms of populations as belonging to some autosomal population, but that doesn't really tell you the whole story. I would suspect, in the case of these men, they're largely men who are sort of self-reporting as having a majority genetic contribution from a Native American population, et cetera, but clearly the community isn't there. And I do think alcohol, not the only contributing factor, is a contributing factor. The case of young white men, similar. Look at the states again, very, very prominent, huge wide open spaces, not many people, and you get a recipe for disaster. and really cut off from what's regarded as the flow of society, the coast. Again, we have this concept of coastal elites, right? Some people talk about it in these terms, but they're cut off from that. They're not part of that culture. It's alien to them. And I think we see a lot of alienation in these types of states in the case of young white men. I know many young white men online who are suffering greatly in isolation, and I can't help them. I wish I could. Some of them quite capable, but they have no opportunities because they live in isolated places, and the opportunities are provided largely either to minorities, women, or people on the coast. So that explains, I think, the general tendency of what you see. Now, of course, the big question is, would there be a genetic contribution to this? There would have to be some genetic contribution. Everything is a combination of genome and environment at the end of the day. White people, on average, do tend to be more individualistic. I'm not sure how that came to be. There's all sorts of speculation, and I'm going to leave it at that. That is the trend. And so we see a lot of young white men shooting themselves. In fact, that's the number one cause of death vis-a-vis gunfire is young white male suicide. And for whatever reason, you don't see this in ghetto black culture. Quite the opposite. You see young black men shooting each other. And we can speculate why that's the case. Is there some genetic contribution? Possibly. I suspect it's not that great. I suspect it has more to do with the structures I've been describing prominently that you can see. It has more to do with the structures I've been describing primarily, these different geographical setups that create an environment where certain groups are much more isolated than others, and this leads to this. So that is kind of an overview of suicide in the United States. Suicide, of course, again, is not limited to the United States. In fact, if you look at Europe, particularly the Baltic countries and Central and Eastern Europe, is just devastated by suicide. Lithuania, depending on the year you survey it, has the highest suicide rate in Europe and one of the top 5 suicide rates in the world. Lithuania is usually battling it out with Japan or South Korea. It just depends on the year, of course. And even the country of my forebears, Hungary, they have a pretty high suicide rate as well. That has a lot to do with the history in those countries. And so we see a consistent pattern of environment shaping almost a culture of suicide that is, I wouldn't argue completely ineluctable, but very difficult to escape nonetheless. And this is what I mean when I say the mainstream does not want to address the underlying causes in suicide itself. Suicide, again, is highly individuated in terms of the specific reasons people do it, but there are overall broad trends, and suicide is not represented equally across populations of men. Of course, women kill themselves too, but at a much lower rate. So I've rambled on enough about suicide itself in a statistical sense. I want to talk more broadly and abstractly about suicide, suicidal ideation, and just suicide in general as a concept. Historically speaking, suicide was not always regarded, particularly in the West, but also elsewhere, obviously, I'll cite some examples, as something negative per se, something that in and of itself was negative. There was a time and a place. In some cases, it was considered noble and virtuous. There have been many famous paintings produced of Seneca the Younger, who, condemned to death by Nero, decided to quietly and very stoically, and with great personal sovereignty, take his life by slitting his veins and bleeding to death. And this, depending on your circle, if it was a Stoic circle in the early empire was regarded as somewhat virtuous. There was a kind of serenity with which he did it. And I don't know if Socrates actually existed as a person or whether he's more of a figurehead, but it's claimed that he voluntarily consumed hemlock upon completion of his trial and his condemnation, and everyone knows the ritual of seppuku in the Japanese samurai tradition, where it is better to take your life than to live in dishonor. And so there are instances strewn throughout the stream of history where suicide is not viewed as an immoral evil. Now along comes Judeo-Christianity, and I will say I am not a fan of monotheism. I'm not a fan of Islam, I'm not a fan of Judaism, and I'm not a fan of Christianity. That's a separate discussion as to why I'm not a fan of these things, but I think that Judeo-Christianity created a tradition in which, quote-unquote, I don't really believe it's actually supported, life is enshrined, and therefore the life of the individual is sacred, and he cannot take his life. It's very, very prominent in the Catholic tradition, which was, of course, the tradition that had existed for the longest period of time in Europe. So there is, in any nation that houses a majority Christian population, a taboo on suicide, or even suicidal ideation. There's always a great deal of moralizing that takes place. There tend to be two lines of argumentation that you can bear witness to, as a rule. There are probably others, but I will only cite the two. One tends to be a kind of almost macho-esque, well, it's good he weeded himself out of the gene pool or some nonsense like that. Something along the lines of, he was just weak, so he deserved the fact that he killed himself. This is a common thing you'll hear from people who are neither suicidal or don't suffer for suicidal ideation. And the other one is, he's so selfish because he killed himself, depriving his friends and family. I don't think suicide has a moral quality to it. I think it's an individual's choice, and as we cannot insert ourselves into other individuals, and we cannot know their personal suffering, or their ability, or for that matter their lack thereof, to cope with certain sets of circumstances, we are not in a good position to judge them should they make a decision to take their lives. If people want to call that weak, whatever, that's fine. Clearly a person who deems suicide as weak hasn't thought very much about it, because if you think about it, to go against the very strong grain in us all, or most of us, to persist in living, to deny the instinct to cling to life, and we're talking bottom of the hierarchy of needs, is a very powerful emotion, at the very least, a very powerful force. I wonder if those who claim and purport that suicide is the mere act of cowardice, I wonder if they too could muster such cowardice, such as to counter the deepest desire people tend to have, which is the desire to live. Was Seneca the Younger a coward for calmly and with great serenity taking his life? And did Socrates, in imbibing the hemlock, participate in a cowardly act? I would tend to think not, but obviously everything is a matter of opinion and interpretation, so I will leave it at that. The other element of suicide is, it's so selfish. Well, to that I would simply say, the people who kill themselves, they had life thrust upon them. The obligations that are, quote-unquote, created are ones that have been created and imposed from without upon within by those who engaged in acts of procreation. And I am not an antinatalist per se, although at times I have sympathies to it, and I can understand both the natalist and the antinatalist perspective. But the idea that there's something inherently selfish about not wanting to suffer anymore strikes me as a bit odd, to say the least. Not least of which, because if a person's quote-unquote loved ones are so indifferent to the individual in question's suffering, and if that suffering is without remedy, and most remedies have been attempted and tried, what type of monster who purports to love and care about such an individual would deny the individual the right to end his life, and as a consequence is suffering? Because the bright side, the probabilistic bright side of death is it's the great nothingness awaits us, and therefore both pain and joy will be absent. But I'm pretty pragmatic about this. I think that if the particular life we're speaking of has more suffering in it, as judged by the individual, and it's an imperfect metric because we're all flawed, than joy, then it only makes sense that eventually, on a long enough timeline, an individual will probably, although not certainly, make that decision. In some cases, they will stick around just for the sake of, because of a sense of obligation, responsibility. Some would call that noble. Some people enshrine suffering as being noble. I don't think it has noble or ignoble qualities. It simply is something. And people deal with it in different ways. Every time I've heard somebody make highly judgmental claims about suicide, whether it's the sort of he wasn't fit enough to live or it's so selfish, it's once again a massive inability to empathize, but also that general tendency that we spoke of in a recent talk with Wojak concerning people's general inability to walk a mile in somebody else's shoes. We see this time and again. Just because you can cope with a certain set of circumstances doesn't mean another person can. And we all have a tolerance threshold for different things, and for different types of illness and different types of stresses, etc., etc. There is no uniform, grade A approved way of dealing with things. There are just suggestions and individuals dealing with those suggestions. But I think the fear and panic that manifests itself, in particular in the United States, has some very interesting qualities. That is, the fear and panic that manifests itself around suicide. In places like Lithuania and Hungary, based on my study of these places, it's not, sure, it's tragic for the people involved, but there isn't this pernicious fear of suicide. I call it a fear of suicide because I think it's deeply linked to a fear of death. In modern Western civilization, I would argue throughout the developed world, we have an overweening and overarching tendency to cling to a pretense of immortality. Everything we do carries with it this idea that we are, quote-unquote, in fact immortal. And any reminder or remembrance of our own forthcoming annihilation and mortality shakes people to their very core, I find. And so I think a lot of the fear and reprimand around suicide, a lot of the distaste for it, a lot of even these this idea that axiomatically every suicide should be prevented by definition. I think some suicides should and could be prevented, and others do not have that justification. Shockingly, the issue is far more nuanced than people claim. And on the matter of death, every suicide reminds us that we're all mortal. Anthony Bourdain's death, untimely as it is, he could have lived another decade easily, reminds us that that fate, though it be not by our own hand, awaits us too. And that is something, well, utterly terrifying for the many, and for the majority of people, particularly in the United States. In addition to community building, I think fundamentalist Christianity has a very powerful assuasion factor in that it takes the sting out of death that most people feel, many people. Take, for instance, my late friend Adam Jensen, who last year, sometime in April, shot himself. The family, a group of fundamentalist Christians, claims it was an accident. Given my friend's familiarity with firearms, his extreme care historically in dealing with them and handling them, and many, many discussions I had had with him, it was very unlikely it was an accident. It's almost certainly a suicide. His life was interesting because, in his case, he grew up in this fundamentalist Christian household in the Midwest. And those of you might remember that talk I had with him 2 years ago about that background. And he was struck with the fear of hell and brimstone and hellfire. And it required of him enormous mental and emotional resources to shake off that feeling of I'm going to end up in this pit. Indeed, through induction and deduction, he derived the probability that the metaphysical claims of his particular Christian sect were not true, in a probabilistic sense, of course, and more likely nothing awaits us after death. But by then the damage had been done. And so he spent the rest of his life in fear and terror of death. seeking a way to combat it, which is why ultimately he became a geneticist specializing in the genetics of aging, because he wanted to defeat death. It all goes back to that fundamentalist Christian upbringing that he had, which instilled a different fear of death in him, and, well, the rest is history, unfortunately. He's gone, and he's never coming back. When I think about it, and this is something deeply personal, but I'll share it with you, I don't think Adam Jensen would have made it much longer. About a year before he committed suicide, he had revealed to me in private conversation that he had regarded me as his best friend. I'd never met him personally. We were online friends, and many people tend to poo-poo those types of relationships and friendships, but I think there's a potential there, not always, but some of them could be quite strong. So let's just assume that his perception of our friendship was correct and that I was his best friend. And the things that he confided in me. He wanted to explore space. He wanted to defeat aging. He wanted to do all these things. He knew, ultimately, that he would not succeed in this. He knew that, at least in his lifetime, humanity would fail at this project. Now, given these desires and the deeply instilled religious fears that he had suffered through in his childhood, when I look at the long run, because he died at age 25, and think, would he have made another year? Maybe 2, 3, 5. I don't think so. Now, I'm not talking about destiny, but in a probabilistic sense, given the set of circumstances that he had been born into, and his way of coping with these things, as well as a horrible ex-girlfriend, which was a contributing factor, who really wrecked his mind, I think that it's very likely he eventually would have killed himself in some capacity. The irony being here, of course, that he was terrified of death. You could call it, I guess, thanophobia of some sort. I'm not sure if that's a neologism, but unironically, it doesn't really not make sense, because if that's your modus operandi in life, doing things that stave off that specter hovering over your head all the time. Let's be honest, death is always hovering over our head. We just don't know it, or we choose not to acknowledge it. We don't know when the Reaper will claim us. It makes sense. I don't think he was going to make it. Of course, if he had said to me, Stardust, look, I'm not feeling well, I need to talk, I would have dropped everything I was doing and would have done my best to keep him alive, if only because a couple of months prior to that I made him promise me, because I had a sense of what might happen, that he was going to outlive me. I said to him, Adam Jensen, you got to promise me, to the best of your capability, that I'm going to die before you. And, well, it turned out not to be the case, obviously. Well, if after long discussion I pose all kinds of reasons why he shouldn't do it, and over time he couldn't find good reasons to keep on going, it's not my place, and would not have been my place, to deny him the end to the suffering, and he was suffering, that he sought. Now, that's obviously a highly personal example. It still affects me today. But I think it's important to cite, because it gives insight into some of these processes, and when and where we can and cannot intervene. Some people are just wired and will eventually do it because of the circumstances of their life, their environment, interacting with their genome. Adam Jensen suffered from depression. He was on a lot of meds, and he was also an alcoholic. And like many, he shot himself and killed himself. And he had a great mind, but intelligence just isn't enough. In fact, oftentimes it fails us completely. I know from many first-hand experiences. Is it our place to always intervene in the choice of an individual? I think not. But the world, and in particular the United States, is terrified of death. They're terrified of the specter that's always there, that could always take us away from the things we care about. Again, I would argue death is not to be feared. Sure, life can be, in some sense, measured by the joy and quote-unquote happiness, the contentment one feels. And if you're living a happy and content life, then I think that there's no particular reason why you would or should contemplate things like suicide. If, however, you're suffering, then you should seek to end that suffering by conventional means. If there's medication, if there's therapy, whatever, you do what you can. And when what you can do is no longer sufficient or was never sufficient, and there are no answers, and you as an individual person, an individual man, make that decision that zero-sum game that we're all playing called life, you want to end yours, it's not within my authority, and it's not my moral right, personally, to deprive you of that. It's your life. It was thrust upon you. And if you want to end it, that's your choice. I think we could benefit from doing away with this universal notion that suicide is evil. Throughout history, different periods in time, as I mentioned in the beginning, there have been different perceptions of suicide. Not all suicides are equal in terms of their causes, so are their outcomes. And we need to be cognizant of that. Now, we need to look at the individual case-by-case basis. We also need to attempt, at the very least, to establish an etiology, which I tried to present earlier, in terms of the dichotomy that exists between tightly knit communities and large conurbations versus widely spread out communities that don't have a lot of contact with their fellow people that on average tend to be more individualistic. These are patterns that are recurrent. We see them all the time. And that is a macro-analysis. But the micro-analysis will have to be tailored to the individual. And what we choose to do with that information, well, I think in a world that has compassion, in a world that actually tries to be ethical, and does not cling to the moral pretenses that it is wont to do, then we really need to look at suicide in context. We need to be reasonable in how we approach it, neither encourage it nor discourage it, but see it for what it is. An end to suffering, in most cases. Sometimes it's born purely out of fear. It does happen. But even in that case, fear is a type of suffering. And take a more nuanced approach to these things. I think this would be better. You could make the argument that moralizing and effectively criminalizing suicide creates strong incentives to prevent it, but I think all evidence shows the contrary, that it's not the case. And even so, when you have a society that tries to forbid a certain type of behavior, you'll always end up with those horrible exceptions and lose a great person or great man in the process. I'm instantly reminded of the untimely death of Alan Turing, who was the father of the computer, co-creator of game theory, along with John von Neumann, who met his own untimely end vis-a-vis suicide because of the draconian measures imposed on him because of his quote-unquote evil gayness. You always lose out. You always lose something. The type of society people want to live in, clearly they have chosen. They want to live in the moralist society where suicide, in the great Judeo-Christian tradition, is regarded as a great evil because it's such an opportunity. Life is always an opportunity, is it not? We hear this endlessly. We hear this endlessly from Jordan Peterson. Peterson would be the type, by the way, to universally condemn suicide. I don't know. I think because it's impossible to walk a mile in the other person's shoes completely, to not perceive and feel their suffering in proper proportion, you can't make these statements. And I think we need to absolutely embrace a multifactorial explanation for suicide, because suicide is a complex phenomenon. By complex, I mean complex in the sense we encounter in science. There are multiple parts working in the system leading to its emergence, leading to it coming into existence. If suicide takes place as a phenomenon, then we need to be aware of the complex factors that go into it and not try to offer a monocausal explanation. I've seen a lot of this of late, a lot of people offering very silly monocausal explanations for Bourdain's death, for suicide in general, that don't really hit the nail on the head. So, I think I have spoken at relative length on this topic. A bit of a long ramble. Some of you enjoy them, some of you don't. Hopefully, if I'm still alive and I'm feeling well enough, there'll be more content to come. As my insomnia gets worse and worse, I really have to just choose the days where I engage in work, either producing video content or doing other work. There are days where I feel so awful, and the dull, thudding headache behind my eyes is so painful that I'm basically a cripple, and so I just vegetate. I can't do much. So the infrequency of videos and the infrequent uploads, they're mostly due to that. Anyway, it's a bit of an explanation why they tend to be so spaced. It's basically on any given day when I'm functional enough to do some work, to exercise, to do the things I need to do, I will use that day to my advantage. And increasingly, they're dwindling and becoming indeed very few in number. So, everyone, thanks for tuning in, and I hope, if my health holds up, that I will catch you later. Enjoy the rest of your week. And may the gods watch over you, and may they prevent you from suffering, and may they bring you more joy than the former in your life. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.